Thank you very much, Charles, for your time on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here, and congratulations on EuroShock.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you today and delighted to discuss the book and all the issues related to it.
And before we get into the thick of things about how the whole saga unfolded, let's go back to 1970s for a moment. You write in your book that you were a US Navy midshipman. What do you remember of your first position those early days?
Well, I was in college during the Vietnam War, and in the U.S. at that time, it was never a question of whether you would serve, but how you serve. And I had the good fortune of being accepted into a naval officers program. I was commissioned in 1970 and immediately set off for the Mediterranean on a destroyer, as first as a gunnery officer and then as a navigator. So I remember a great deal because these were formative years. Serving as a gunnery officer on a naval advanced destroyer was quite a challenge. And these were difficult times. Ironically, as I look at some of the turbulence in the Middle East today, it was turbulence in the Middle East that brought me on my first trip to the Mediterranean and for the first time brought me to Greece.
Yeah, and before the world of caviars and French wine you enjoyed as a banker, you survived for 5 weeks at sea on powdered milk and potatoes before you landed into Greece,
Well,
did you?
it does happen sometimes. You know, combatants never carry enough store for more than 2 weeks or so at sea. And so when you're out there for an extended period of time, you need to hook up with a supply ship. Or in our case, we were too busy to be
Right.
resupplied. And we had to go straight to a region of turmoil off the coast of Jordan. And this was a period called Black September in the history of the Middle East when many terrorists tried to overthrow the government of Jordan. And so we did have to survive off a lot of powdered milk and powdered eggs. But, the military
Yeah.
teaches you discipline. It teaches you survival during hardship. And there were a lot of soldiers and sailors who went through much tougher times than I did.
And we take quite a few things for granted these days in the that we live in, era that we live in. Back in the day, you also had to look at the stars to just locate your position in the deep, dark sea, was it? I found that as quite interesting that the technology was not up to speed. Just explain that in layman's terms for somebody who has nothing to do with the Navy.
Well,
What did you go?
well, after I served as gunnery officer, I became the navigator on this guided missile destroyer. And in order to determine your location, you have to trust your ability to navigate according to dead reckoning when you're at sea, which means charting your course on the basis of tides and direction. Or you use the stars. You use celestial bodies, the stars, the moon, and the sun, to determine, and you have to use the sextant to do that. And this was absolutely at the very early days of computer navigation. In fact, it wasn't even installed on my ship when I got there. We had something called LORAN, which was radio wave navigation, but it was very, very unreliable. And so the most reliable way to determine your location at sea was to use a sextant to measure the of a star above the horizon, and you do that on 6, 7, 8 stars, and then you go through enormously complicated calculations determined at the time not by a computer but by a series of books, manual books, which you had on your desk, and then you can determine your location within some degree of precision. This was a challenging enterprise, but in some ways it was a glorious enterprise because as a navigator, I was privileged to stand out under the stars every morning as the horizon began to appear. You can't do this in the middle of the night because you have no horizon, and you can't do it in the middle of the day because you have too much horizon and the stars disappear from your view. So there's only a few minutes every morning and every evening when you can actually take the sights, and we did that, and that's how we navigated across the Atlantic and how we navigated in the Mediterranean Sea as well. Only in the last few years has the Naval Academy in the U.S. brought back the use of sextants, and I'm glad to see that because it's an ancient art which should be preserved.
And you talked about those lessons in self-discipline. Can you illustrate that with a couple of examples as to those days? How did they help you in your day job as a banker, then as a negotiator, and then, of course, your pivotal role in trying to deal with the euro crisis?
It's a very good question, Abhishek. And you learn lessons of leadership when you're on the line. You know, on the first trip I took, we had an accident when we were at sea refueling, and the refueling lines between the destroyer and the tanker split, and oil spilled all over the deck. And we had sailors who were out there working with the refueling who suddenly were cast about on the deck in stormy weather, slipping on oil and at risk of falling overboard. As their officer at the time, it was my responsibility to go out there and physically help them. You have to be prepared to meet challenges and grow up fast when you're in the military. It doesn't matter whether it's the U.S. military, the Indian military, the British, you name it. And you learn these lessons of leadership, which can stay with you throughout a career. I learned the importance of teamwork in the Navy. I learned the importance of being decisive in the Navy. I learned how you can exercise discipline. As a navigator, you never slept more than a couple of hours at a time because you always had to be conscious of the need to adjust the course of the ship when you were at sea. This is the nature of military service, and in many ways, it's becoming, I think, a more selective service in the United States and around the world these days, as not too many countries have conscription. I'm a great supporter of required public service, either military or non-military, for every young man and woman, because I think it breeds a certain level of discipline and a certain level of maturity, which can stay with you throughout a career. And certainly during the dark days of these negotiations, you rely upon some of these old lessons of working with a team. Leadership is not just about being decisive and finding the right strategy. It's about working with a team. And those are one of the first lessons you learn when you're in the Navy or any service in the military.
And then there came a time, Charles, you decided that you wanted to move on. In 1974, was it, when you decided that you'd go in for an advanced degree in international economics? What prompted you to take that route?
Well, I had been intrigued by international economics as an undergraduate student at the University of South Carolina. And I had decided really that I was more than willing and honored to do my required 4 years of service in the Navy. But I knew I only had one fundamental career choice in front of me, and I wanted to get back into the field of international economics and international finance. And so after my 4 years of duty were over, and my last year and a half, I was not on a destroyer at all. I had the privilege and the honor of serving as the Admiral's aide to the Navy's first African-American admiral in the history of the U.S. Navy. And he was a wonderful leader, a wonderful man, and a remarkable individual who beat tremendous odds to become an admiral in the Navy, because when he joined, the Navy was definitely not treating African-American sailors with equality as they do today. And he had many hurdles to overcome in his career. But I explained to him that I saw my future in the field of international economics, and I decided to go back to school and studied for a couple of master's degrees and then eventually a PhD at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And I was fortunate coming out of that to end up early in my career at the U.S. Treasury Department.
Yes, Ronald Reagan appointed you to the IMF, where you were involved in managing the debt crises in Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, among others. But I'm interested to know, who was that HR manager who didn't think you were fit enough for the role in the first place, and later you basically, the president appointed you there? Isn't that right? There's something happened?
When you apply, I do remember applying for a job at the International Monetary Fund and coming out of graduate school. And at the time, I only had my master's. And they said, but I had done all the coursework for a doctorate, but had not completed the dissertation. And I was told by the HR manager at the IMF that they would prefer to have a full doctorate in economics, and they would prefer it to be from a more traditional school, as they claimed, at Stanford, Harvard, University of Chicago. And I explained to them that the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy had a very strong international economics program, but they also forced you. It was required as part of the school's approach to international studies to engage in cross-disciplinary study, to study international politics, to study international diplomacy, to study diplomatic history, to study development economics as well as international economics. And frankly, when I got to the Treasury and eventually to the IMF, that served me very well, because I realized that issues of international economics, particularly in the world, can never be extracted from or separated from issues of international politics, geopolitical diplomacy, cultural issues, historical factors, and they came to play in virtually every debt crisis that I ever worked in. But, I came back and looked with a smile when I ended up being the U.S. director at the IMF instead of being part of their staff.
And did you meet the HR manager again there? Did you
I
happen
did,
to
I
run into
did,
him?
and he was a bit sheepish, but that's okay. I do remember him asking me whether or not I was going to try to get him fired, and I paused for a minute and said, no, I don't think that's necessary or appropriate. These things happen in life.
Yeah.
You run into hurdles and challenges along the way, and I was actually very fortunate that instead of starting my professional career as an international economist at the IMF, that I started it at the U.S. Treasury Department, which gave me early access to some brilliant policymakers. And I learned at the feet of some of the best in the world in those days. And so for those first years, I was a civil servant there before I had the honor of being appointed to the political positions by Presidents Reagan and Bush Sr. I learned as a civil servant at the feet of some of the best international policymakers that existed at the time in the U.S. Treasury.
And the book, EuroShock, you write how the largest debt restructuring in history helped save Greece and preserve the Eurozone. It's nearly 13 years or 14 years
Yes.
since the landmark event took place. And just walk us through the years leading up to 2010. Your book also suggests that the seed of the crisis or the groundwork was laid back in 1981 under the Papandreou government, if I'm pronouncing it right. And later, the IMF mission in 1985 also said, and I quote, that Greece was heading for an obvious crisis. So it had been simmering for a while until it came to a boil.
Well, it had been. I think that this is where these interconnections, the intricacies of politics, of history, of culture, overlay with finances and economics. And I think the history of modern Greece goes back 2 centuries now, because the country of Greece was formed just a little over 2 centuries ago when it became one of the first European countries to break out of the Ottoman Empire. It was the first to break out of the Ottoman Empire, one of the first to make an effort to launch a new democratic form of government, following in many ways the inspiration coming out of the United States and France. But it was a very difficult time in doing so. And over the years, they had difficulty establishing the institutions with sufficient authority and integrity to build a framework for solid economic and political governance. After World War II, it's very important to recommend or to recall that Greece was engaged in a bitter and fierce, violent and deathly civil war that lasted until 1949. Many of us think of World War II coming to an end in 1945, as it did, but war didn't stop in Greece until late 1949, when first the British and then the U.S. stepped in to support the nationalists there. In the ensuing decades, they moved from one conservative government to a liberal government or a socialist government, back and forth, back and forth. And over time, they built a very state-heavy, bureaucratic-heavy, sluggish economic model, which did not position them well to compete in the global economy. However, they joined the European Union in the early 80s, and they tried to integrate somewhat into the European economy, but it was not a complete success. They made some progress. They started to privatize some parts of their economy, but it was still heavily state-owned, heavily regulated, heavily bureaucratized, many layers of administration, riddled with inefficiencies. In early thousands, however, with the creation of the euro, they wanted to belong to the Eurozone. And they were not one of the inaugural members, but they came across just a year or two later and were able to persuade the authorities of the previous or the initial members of the Eurozone that they were eligible to join. Now, one can go back and question whether or not that was a wise and well-founded decision, but it happened. During the decade of 2001 to 2009, capital poured into Greece. Why? Because initially, investors, particularly bond investors, could get much better returns in Greece holding Greek debt than they could get holding German or Dutch or French debt. But they thought they were taking more or less the same risk as German Dutch, or French debt because they were all part of the Eurozone, and they assumed, erroneously, very inaccurately, that Germany would be there to bail out Greece if it got into trouble. So, unfortunately, during the course of the decade of 2001 to 2009, a near decade, which I call the decade of delusion, the markets and the government engaged in a tremendous amount of borrowing and built up a huge debt. This debt was not matched with a comparable degree of increase in competitiveness. And so they found themselves in the fall of 2009 with an increasingly large budget deficit, an increasingly large sovereign debt, and an increasingly skeptical group of investors and financiers when the government took office in the fall of 2009 under another Papandreou, and this was George Papandreou, the son of the previous prime minister and the grandson of another prime minister. The Papandreou family had been well known in Greek politics for many years, and the grandfather of George Papandreou, who was elected in the fall of 2009, is still highly regarded today as one of the icons of modern Greece. However, when George Papandreou took office as prime minister in the fall of 2009, he quickly learned from his finance minister that the fiscal deficit was much larger than had previously been announced. Instead of 5%, it was announced first at 8%. Then they had to correct that number and they announced it at 11%. Then they had to correct that number and they announced it was 14.5 to 15%. By that point, the markets had totally lost confidence in Greece and the crisis erupted.
I wonder what kind of conversations the Papandreou families would have. The grandchild might tell his grandfather, it's all down to you. It's all because of you. I have to deal with this mess.
Well, you know how these political families, and these are all honorable men, and I have great respect. Of course, I didn't know the father and the grandfather, but I know George Papandreou quite well, and he is an honorable man, but he wasn't prepared, as no one would have been prepared, in my view, to walk into a crisis which was just about to erupt under his feet, because it's unusual for a country to announce one day that it has a 5% fiscal deficit, and then 3 weeks later announce that it has an 8% deficit, and then 3 weeks more, 11% deficit, and then another few weeks, a 14 to 15% deficit. That rarely, if ever, happens, and this pulled the rug out from any market confidence, and he was thrown asunder into this chaotic economic environment. And frankly, not only was he not fully prepared for this crisis, but neither was Europe. And that's one of the crucial points to make here, is that Europe did not have the firewall to stabilize Greece. They did not have the policy framework to stabilize Greece. And so they scrambled. They scrambled for quite a while before stability was resurrected in Greece again. And that's the difficult task they faced to bring some stability back to Greece was why we, the private sector, were called in along the way, particularly in the course of 2010-11.
Take us for a moment, Charles, inside that negotiating room where you were among the chief negotiators along with Jean Lemaire, your friend and confidant and your colleague at the time, and you were on behalf of the creditors. So the whole idea, as I understood it, was that, all right, we know that Greece may default, we need to rescue it for our own benefit and that of the entire Eurozone. And now you are in that room. How typically would the conversations go? I mean, it's not just once, and then there are stories where you were in a room with the folks where the buck stops, and sometimes you are in a room with people who don't know why they are there. Maybe they didn't have the mandate, quote unquote, with due respect, but you still had to continue the meeting. Just take us through the chaos on a typical day of you being in one of those rooms.
Well, the negotiation went through phases, and the first phase that was difficult actually was even beginning the negotiations, because there was a fierce debate. Did Greece need an actual restructuring of its debt or not? And there was a widespread view in European official circles that was also embraced by the IMF, right up until the summer of 2011, and this is important to understand, for almost 2 years, this crisis raged. And the initial attempts during that 2 year period were to try to restructure the policies to launch a wide range of fiscal and structural economic reforms, but not to touch the debt. Those of us who held the debt, those of us who represented the creditors who had extended the debt, increasingly, however, came to the view that something's got to change. And there were also academics and even staff at the IMF who increasingly saw that we would need to launch a debt restructuring and actually reduce the level of the debt. However, the European Central Bank, led at the time by a wonderful economist and a dedicated European leader, Jean-Claude Trichet, he was firm, and so were other European leaders, that there would be no debt restructuring. So we had this intense kabuki dance for months on end. Will there be a debt restructuring or not? And meanwhile, the Greek economy was continuing to sink. And I mean really sink. I mean, we're talking about a contraction of an economy in the order of 4% a year, 5% a year, 6% a year. And these kind of contractions they just don't happen in modern industrial countries. Getting back to the actual negotiations, once we were actually able to launch them, there was tremendous uncertainty and confusion during the first few months in the negotiations because there was still this hesitancy within European official circles. Should we really restructure the debt? And so that's when we found it very frustrating because we kept engaging first with the deputy finance minister of Italy, a very capable finance official, but who was understandably deeply concerned about the potential that a Greek restructuring might adversely affect Italy's position. Because at the time, it's very important to remember that at the time Greece was on fire, there were 4 other national fires burning in Europe. Started in Ireland, it spread to Greece, but it also spread to Portugal, Spain, and Italy. So you had 5 countries which were economically and financially destabilized, each in its own crisis, and each with its own particular struggle to rebuild market confidence and rebuild economic momentum. So we had this gentleman who was appointed by Brussels to lead the Greek negotiations, who was actually, and this is rather bizarre, an Italian official, understandably more concerned about the future of the Italian economy than the Greek economy. The Greek officials in the negotiations had no authority, no agency, you might say, and therefore it was very difficult to find someone across the table with whom we could legitimately negotiate. In all of my past history, and you mentioned that during my years at the Treasury and also during my years at the Institute of International Finance, I had been heavily involved in various sovereign debt crises. And it started in the early 1980s with the crisis first in Mexico in 1982, and then that rolled into Brazil, Argentina, many others during the course of the 1980s. I've been intimately involved in the creation of the Brady Plan in the late 1890s that fortunately and with tremendous leadership by former Treasury Secretary Nicholas F. Brady, broke the back of the European debt crisis and unleashed a good bit of growth in Mexico in 1989 and going into the knees. But during all those years, I had always known who was on the other side of the table.
Right.
During those years, generally it was always the finance officials of the debtor country who would be representing the debtor country. And it was the creditors, the bankers, who would be representing the creditors. And then as a Treasury official, we were in the middle, often trying to get both sides to deal seriously with one another and to manage the crisis and then overcome the crisis. In the case of Greece, there was no clarity on who really was in charge. There was no mandate given. And so finally, yes, we had to go all the way up the line to Chancellor Merkel and President Sarkozy in order to meet with someone who had the necessary authority to negotiate with us. And that was a crucial turning point of the negotiations, because at that point, we actually were able to then begin to engage in the concrete discussions which were always necessary about debt restructuring.
And the former president of France, you referred to Sarkozy, he was not quite pleased with the way things were turning out. And you mentioned that in the book quite vividly. And he had his, how was it to be in a room with him?
Well, he was a demonstrative man, let's put it that way. And he did not withhold his frustrations with the banks for what he thought was contributing to this crisis in Greece, and frankly, from his point of view, contributing to a crisis within Europe. And he was rather angry, rather challenging, and at times a bit threatening. But I learned over the years, I dealt with a lot of heads of state around the world, not just in Latin America, but in places like Egypt and the Philippines. And I had the benefit of having with me a French patriot, a wonderful colleague, Jean Lemierre, and he and I had prepared for our engagement with President Sarkozy. But, it underscored the urgency of dealing with the problem. And so in many ways, it's not always bad when you go through these difficult moments with a head of state, because sometimes it can break the deadlock. And indeed, between his leadership and that of Chancellor Merkel, we were finally able to engage in some concrete negotiations, which eventually, by the spring of 2012, led us into this historic agreement. And this took a great deal of patience and a great deal of fortitude on the part of everyone, because the Greek economy was in terrible plight. And it's hard for me to exaggerate the pain which emerged in the Greek population during this period. Unemployment went through the roof. Overall unemployment, the numbers pushed up close to 30%, and youth unemployment pushed over 40%. This simply doesn't happen in modern industrialized economies. You never see numbers this painful. Outbound immigration from Greece, a country of only 11 or so million people, began to flood, and you had immigration over the course of the next years, which pushed up toward 1 million people. They lost tremendous stock of capital in the country because it was not renovated, it was not refurbished, it was not refinanced, and it was an extraordinarily difficult time for the Greek people, as well as posing serious challenges for the markets, because the markets were during this period constantly on edge about whether or not Greece would be restructured, whether or not the Eurozone could hold together. And this is one of the crucial lessons here. The creation of the euro, which many people take for granted today, was not something you could take for granted 30 or 40 years ago. It had been conceived by European leaders in various ideas and discussions going back as far as the 1960s. But it became a concrete goal for European leaders emerging in the late 1970s. And step by step, they prepared to create this common currency, which was a major achievement. The problem was that they did not build a common fiscal framework for Europe around this common currency. And this had been part of the initial plan. It had been part of the initial framework that had been designed by European leaders in the late 70s and in the early 80s. And I remember, as a senior Treasury official, discussing these matters at the time inside the Treasury Department. But the euro was kind of the crown jewel in the hat of economic integration of Europe when it was created in the late 90s. And here it was under tremendous pressure. And so it was not only a question of would the Greek economy survive, would the euro survive?
And that's why you had Chancellor Merkel negotiating and getting involved. And I'd like to know this, when she looked straight into your eyes across the table and she told you that you should reconsider the 21% haircut that you had proposed in that agreement back then, and that you should do better. And she used the words, "Are you prepared to?" Now, a boy who grew up amidst cotton textiles and peaches near the Blue Ridge Mountains in Spartanburg was in the spotlight. How did you deal with those moments?
Well, you have to be prepared to rise to an occasion. And I think Jean and I were. We had been prepared for this question. We talked it over. I come back to some of these lessons of teamwork that I learned in the Navy, that I learned in the military. We had really three strong teams around us. One was our core team that supported us from the IIF staff, the Institute of International Finance staff, two marvelous economists who were sitting beside Jean and me, not in these meetings with Merkel, but in all the preparatory meetings, doing all the hard analytical work behind them. Jean and I had the benefit of Hung Tran and a fellow named Mikos Hadjimichael who spoke Greek. He was from Cyprus, and he could read Greek. He was a marvelous talent. Both of them were. But we also had other frameworks of teamwork around us, including an advisory committee of mid to senior level officers in each of the banks that were creditors, and there were about 20 to 25 of them actively engaged with us in talking these things over, preparing. And then, of course, we had our board of directors at the IIF, and I had a great chairman, Joe Ackerman at the time, who was CEO of Deutsche Bank. But it wasn't just the chairman, and it wasn't just the board. It was the engagement that we felt from so many people. So when Merkel asked us to move 21 beyond 21%, which we knew at that point was not sustainable, and we knew we had to move up. We were more than willing to consider moving up toward or close to a 50% haircut. Mind you, when we consider this involved massive potential losses for the creditors that we represented. And there was an irony to this, because here it was the creditors who had initiated the negotiations. And it's the only time in modern financial history that I'm aware of when you actually have the creditors seeking a negotiation that would inevitably result in a serious impairment of their balance sheets, serious writing down of their claims on the debtor. But we knew that unless this boil was lanced, unless this crisis was resolved, Italy could be pulled under as well. And the same banks, the same pension funds, the same insurance companies that had loaned all this money to Greece had also loaned a ton of money to Italy. And in fact, in many cases, it was 2, 3, 4 times as much. So if the Greek crisis completely blew up, it seemed almost inevitable that that Italy would be pulled into the vortex of this storm, and the banks would lose even more. So they were willing to accept this substantial pain, and we kept talking to them. The losses could mount to 40%, could mount to 50%, could even go above 60%. Eventually, the amount of losses we agreed to for the creditors equaled 73% of the net present value of their claims. This was historically one of the largest write-offs. Well, it was the largest quantitatively write-off in history. We wiped out over 100 billion euro of claims in one day, and we took another 100 billion and stretched it out over a 30-year period. But the creditors had something else in mind as well. The leaders of these financial institutions, the top financial leaders of Europe, had a sense of underlying commitment to the integration, the economic and financial integration of Europe. And they did not want part of their legacy to be that they were at the helm of a bank or an insurance company or a pension fund when the Eurozone was ripped apart. They wanted to be part of the building of Europe, not a part of the economic and financial destruction of Europe. And that was in some ways also a serious motivating factor in these negotiations. Otherwise, Jean and I could have never convinced them to accept a loss this large.
And did the creditors, who were bankers primarily, most of them, also come under some blame that, hey, it is you who caused the whole crisis? So that was the refrain back then, that it was really smart people making some decisions because of greed that caused all of this to happen in the first place. Was that a tricky position for you to be in, because you were trying to rescue Greece, but some people may point to you saying, hey, you got us into trouble in the first place?
Well, yes, in some ways that's true. But, early in my Treasury career, I had been to Mexico as their debt crisis was beginning to build. And I had chosen as a young Treasury officer to offer my advice to the Mexicans about how they could fix their problems. And I came across probably as a bit of a lecturer to the Mexican officials. And when I left the meeting room, my senior Treasury official turned to me and he said, we're not here to lecture these people. We're to help them solve our problems because their problems are our problems. So always view yourself as a problem solver. And so that's how I viewed myself there. Of course, it's undeniable that the creditors, and they weren't just bankers, I think it's important to point out insurance companies poured money into Greek bonds. Pension
Right.
funds did as well. But yes, they were largely bankers. But I think it's undeniable that this was part of the problem that created this crisis. But you can't disengage that from the bad policies that were followed by many Greek governments over the years that led them into these difficulties. These governments had been characterized by fiscal mismanagement, by a failure to pay taxes, by a Greek economy which had become very structurally inefficient and too dominated by and too heavily regulated by state-owned enterprises and state administration and state government policies, a Greek economy which had a very weak and dysfunctional judicial system to resolve problems in the private sector, a Greek economy which did not encourage, in fact, actively discouraged private enterprise and private entrepreneurialism. So you had a set of both fiscal mismanagement issues overlaid on top of a set of structural economic problems which had built up in the Greek economy for years. And then you had the contemporary reality that the Greek crisis was associated with these four other national crises. And so Greece was caught in a swirl of instability, which was partly of its making, but only partly of its making. And you had a Eurozone which was unprepared to cope with this. So were the bankers and the creditors partly responsible for this crisis? Absolutely. And one of the crucial lessons that I am trying to get across as I present talks on this book is that we need to think long and hard about strengthening the standards for those who underwrite sovereign debt, but also strengthening the standards and the requirements for those in the government finance offices that actually engage in raising this debt. Because for every loan that gets into trouble in a sovereign debt crisis, someone reached out in the capital markets in the debt management office of that same country 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years earlier and decided to initiate that exercise. And this is something that I think has been a little bit lost in this debate. How can we bring about a world where sovereign debt is managed much more carefully, with much greater discipline, with much greater sense of risk management, with much greater integrity by both the borrowers in the treasury departments of these countries and by the lenders and the underwriters? And I am convinced that we need to have higher standards and more rigorous tests of experience on both sides of this equation in order to minimize the risk. Because in the end of the day, as painful as this was for these financial institutions, I can tell you that pain did not even begin to match the pain in the Greek population. Now, you can ask the question, was the Greek population partly responsible for this? And of course, in any democracy, population has to take some responsibility for the people they elect. But I think that it's important to remember that the choices presented to the Greek people over the years, over the decades since the end of World War II and the Civil War, were not always choices between sound economic management and poor economic management. This was a political framework to these elections that went on over the years. And of course, there was a period in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, a period of, I think, around 7 years, when Greece was ruled by the military as a result of a coup. So this was a country which was still trying to establish the institutional legitimacy and framework for its modern form of democracy. And it is a country which first brought to us the concepts of democracy. And so Greece was still trying to put those lessons into effect centuries, 2 millennia after it brought to the world these concepts of democracy. And there's a certain irony in all of this, but the reality is that the Greek people suffered tremendously. And even today, and here I give huge credit to the current government of Greece, the Mitsotakis government, for helping pull this country out of the abyss and facilitated, yes, in part by our massive debt restructuring, because it has definitely lightened the debt service burden on the Greek balance sheet and on the Greek sovereign financial picture. But I give tremendous credit to the current government of Greece, which has been in office now for over 6 years and has done a great job of implementing a wide range of economic reforms. But still, even today, many Greek people in the lower echelons of income are struggling to make ends meet. And it hasn't been an easy time going through COVID, going through this period of high inflation. So I think we all have to look and ask, what are our responsibilities for this massive crisis, which just about ripped the euro apart and did plunge the Greek economy into the worst depression in modern industrial history.
And the Greek people that you refer to, Charles, they love you, don't they? They put you in the Greece's most popular daily in a cartoon. Where was it flattering to see you there, to see yourself there in the context
Well,
of the
I
negotiations?
don't know if they love me, but there was an irony to all of this. I guess a country can only have so many villains at one time, and the banks are often the villain, but in this case, the villain came across more as Germany and the IMF, the so-called Troika, were viewed as the villains. And it is true that Jean and I, my co-conspirator, my colleague Jean Lemierre and I, and the team we represented of creditors, tried to understand the realities that the Greek people faced, not just the Greek policymakers. And I think it's always important that you listen. In my many years of negotiating with foreign officials, I always told myself, try to understand the culture, the perspective, and the mentality of whoever's on the other side of the table. And many of the Greek officials who were representing Greece at this time have become good friends of mine, and I have huge respect for them. There was one in particular that I would single out as we approach the end of this session, and that is the prime minister who took over after Papandreou. His name was Lucas Papademos, and he was a marvelous central banker turned politician. He didn't have a political bone in his body, but he was the right man at the right time when he was appointed as the head of a technocratic government in the fall of 2000. And it was through negotiating directly with him that we made tremendous progress in finally reaching the agreement we did in the spring of 2000. And I have huge admiration for him, but I also admire the other Greek public sector officials, many of whom were very dedicated to their job. At the same time, the size and capabilities of the Greek public sector clearly could benefit from another wave of reform.
Lovely, Charles. Thank you so much for your time on this podcast and for writing EuroShock. I've enjoyed this. Does not have, it speaks to someone who may not necessarily have a background in economics. It's like a fiction, but it's very much true, where you take us into those hallowed, one of the meetings happened in a place where Napoleon was married, is what you say,
Oh, yes.
what you write, right?
Yes. At the headquarters of BNP Paribas. They've now shifted their headquarters now, but we were sitting in the room where he was married centuries ago. There's a lot of history in Europe, and you have to admire that history, but you have to learn from that history at the same time, right? And I think this is why it's so important that European leaders and global leaders learn from this period of crisis. The IMF needs to learn, and this is a final point I would point out, is the IMF did not handle the negotiations as well as it could have, particularly in terms of managing the fiscal austerity in the Greek economy during the crisis, because they probably asked for more belt tightening than Greece was capable of at the time. And as a result, this may well have increased unemployment beyond what needed to happen. These things are not difficult, but I think it's always important when you go through these crises to step back, catch your breath. We can do that now in Greece because they're on the rise. But we still have to ask ourselves, What are the lessons learned? And that's part of the reason why I wrote this book.
And will Marcus Aurelius be proud of you? You read his Meditations, among other books, where you did not lose your mind when you did not agree with the IMF, or you sat quietly when Sarkozy did his
Well,
histrionics.
I don't know whether he'd be proud of me, but I think that we all could benefit in the midst of crisis with a bit of focus and stoicism. Let me put it that
Lovely.
way. And Marcus Aurelius was certainly a great inspiration in that respect. It's a pleasure talking with you, and I'm honored
Thank
to
you,
have been on
Charles.
your podcast.